China's working on its Made in China 2025 push.
The US is playing with fire, but China has fire too.
Global economic powerhouse.
Young Chinese people are becoming disillusioned with everyday life.
China has mobile payment,
cashless.
in cashless society, all use QR codes.
China. People think I don't like China. I love China.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of China WTF.
Hello.
So we launched a podcast 2 episodes ago, and we launched it with 2 interviews. One focused on influencer marketing alongside live streaming, and one focusing on WeChat specifically. And we had some great guests. We had Lauren Hallinan and Matthew Brennan, both experts in their own right. Please go check them out if you haven't already. I promise it's worth your time. So for this episode, we want to start creating some kind of consistency, or kind of like, I guess, go back to regular programming, creating some consistency, some cadence. And today we want to focus, I think it's a good start to focus on Chinese consumers, right? We always talk about people and cultures at Qumin. So we thought go back to basics and talk about Chinese consumers, why they're different to Western consumers, but also how social media, digital and e-commerce has affected and changed consumerism in China drastically. But before we start, you might be wondering who this lovely lady sitting next to me is. She's Louisa, and she's the brains behind the operation over the last couple of episodes. So Louisa's been in China, studied in China. You studied Chinese. Yeah. You even wrote your dissertation on Little Red Book.
I did.
So we thought it would be great to have you on the show. I guess to just kind of bounce ideas off and bounce conversation topics off. Maybe you could introduce to our audience about you a little bit more.
Sure. So thank you for having me.
You're welcome.
As you gathered, my name's Louise. I'm the marketing executive at Qumin, and I deal with China every single day. I studied Chinese as my undergraduate degree, lived in Shanghai for a year, traveled probably more places than the average Chinese person in China.
Definitely more than I have.
And yeah, live and breathe China. So I'm really happy to be able to have the opportunity and the platform to talk about China all day, every day.
Awesome.
So thanks for having me.
So we want to kind of start the conversation, like I said, on Chinese consumers. And I guess the first thing is probably maybe a bit of background about consumerism in China and how it's changed over the last 40 years. So Qumin's mission is open the world to China, and the reason we use that as our mission is because China was closed for such a long time. Previously, China was, I guess, a very poor country made up mostly of farmers. And over the last 40 years, and we saw a piece of news today on Twitter, actually, Louisa showed me earlier, that China has been growing for almost 10% year on year for the last 40 years consistently. And the news piece was about how consumerism, it needs to be at 6.5% in order to drive consumerism and for the country to develop consistently. And China has done that. And I remember, actually, it kind of takes me back to my childhood. So I grew up in China, and I came to the UK when I was 11. I remember when I was growing up, the products you could buy in China were all very Chinese. They were all made in China, designed in China. Everything was very local and very domestic. People didn't really have access to foreign products outside of China. So I guess probably my most vivid memory was I never had one, but my friends had them, and they were awesome. They were like, we would also go around his house and play them. It was like I don't know if many of our audience remember, some might be too young to remember, like the Nintendo SNES. Do you remember that, Louisa?
No, I don't.
No, okay, you're too young. Wow, showing my age here. So a Nintendo SNES is like the console before like you probably didn't remember the Nintendo 64.
No, I do, yeah.
Ah, great,
yes.
yeah. So like the console before Nintendo 64. I remember we had like our version in China. It was like a little yellow box, and it was promoted by Jackie Chan. It was awesome. So you kind of get all the games, like the Olympic games on there. But it was very Chinese. It had like Chinese branding. It was called Xiaobaowang. And as far as I was concerned, as far as anyone else was concerned, it was basically something that was innovated in China, made in China, designed in China. Like no one knew it was a copied product of a foreign product. And that's what China was known for such a long time, right? It was like a nation of copycats. It was always copying products. The outside world would see China as a nation that copied things. But people in China didn't know that. We were just like, China is great. We got all these cool products that was kind of designed and made domestically. And as I grew up, especially as I kind of like came to the UK after primary school, I realized that actually China was really copying a lot of products from outside of China. And throughout the last kind of like, I guess, 20 years I was growing up, I realized that you saw the change, right? Everyone kind of like saw the change outside of China, how China started to create their own products, their own services, mainly around service design, so around digital and e-commerce, which we can talk about later on. But I guess the main thing is that Chinese consumers were exposed to foreign products in a very short period of time, right? So going from domestic products that were essentially copies, like rip-offs, like to put it bluntly, of foreign products, to being able to access the originals. Like as good as this Xiaobao one was, it wasn't as good as the SNES. Just as kind of like other products that were copies of foreign products. So
definitely a very interesting shift from going from copying something in a bad way to copying it in a good way, and then to now not having to necessarily copy, but to be able to innovate now. So it's going from copycats to innovators, which is really interesting.
Yeah, exactly.
Really
and we saw that. It's kind of like we see that with social media, right? It's almost like, I remember when WeChat first came out, you probably remember this as well, and everyone was like, oh, but this is just like a copy of WhatsApp. Or when Weibo came out, everyone was like, this is just a copy of Twitter. But then they evolved beyond that to become something that what they copied from would then copy. Which is really weird. And I think that kind of summarizes China in a very kind of like succinct example, in the sense that Chinese people, innovation in China is different, right? And innovation is very different to invention anyway. It's not about creating something completely new. It's about making something that exists better for its purpose. I think China is very good at that and has always been very good at that. And the example is obviously kind of some of these social media channels. But from a consumerism point of view, I think Chinese people are starting to get used to foreign brands in China, and the way they see foreign brands. I remember, I think it was Lauren that was talking about this. It's very different to kind of like for example, a UK person would see Burberry different to like how a Chinese person would see Burberry, because it's very new, right? They don't have the associated history that UK person would have. So when brands are looking to target Chinese consumers, a lot of brands, I think, fall into the trap of saying Chinese people love heritage, Chinese people love history, and they forget that it's actually okay to create maybe like your brand story from scratch, or kind of like your the way you articulate your brand from scratch, and then people fall into the trap of treating Chinese consumers as they would treat their kind of global and Western consumers. But I guess that's kind of like one key thing about Chinese consumers. I think this probably leads nicely onto, because we mentioned earlier about kind of social media platforms and WeChat and Weibo, how they're innovating. They've innovated past the platforms they've copied from, right? And that's really weird. That's like a really interesting subject. So how has WeChat innovated past the platform that it copied from and that it spawned from? So I think, and this will lead nicely onto e-commerce later as well. So I think we'll probably start, as we always do with kind of like people and cultures. I think something like WeChat will never work in the West. I don't think it'll ever work in the West, because the QR code format, right? We tried to use a QR code format in the West. Like, we tried to use it many times before and no one picked it up. Like, why?
For a long time, I didn't even know that the function in my iPhone existed, that I could actually use my camera to scan something. And then if I do, what do I do with it?
It's because it's useless.
It doesn't really go anywhere.
Without any platforms that enables a QR format, it's fundamentally useless. Like, what you can do with it? It's like a gimmick, right? You scan it, you go to a website. Great. What now? I would just like browse a website. Could have just gone onto
the website.
So what WeChat did was, I think there's a couple of reasons, right? One is that Chinese people, so because everything was very stable, very consistent, there wasn't much innovation happening before the kind of like the 80s and the 90s. Chinese people had a very consistent way of living. They didn't have like new technologies. Like the industrial revolution that happened in the West over 100 years didn't happen in China until much recently, kind of around 70s, 80s, 90s, where it happened over only like 20 years, for example. And we always say this, Qumin always say this as well, is that kind of like left people with a desire to see changes. Like it's a fast adaptation culture that's influenced by the rapid change in kind of socioeconomic situations in China. And if you had an app from scratch, well, first of all, you wouldn't have an app from scratch that was kind of like a messaging app that lived only on your mobile phone, because you already had WhatsApp. But if you had an app from scratch that lived just on your mobile phones with just QR code, using QR to connect to each other, I don't think we would have the audience in the West to enable that to pick up traction, because people don't need to change their current way of using like a social media app, right? They already had like Facebook Messenger, or they have WhatsApp, like text messages was already big. So Apple had like live text messages way before WhatsApp, not way before, like kind of before WhatsApp, but way before WeChat existed. So people already had this function, or people already had kind of like a way in their life to product in their life to be able to talk to their friends over their mobile phones, really easily have conversations. But that didn't really exist in China. So China didn't have live text messages. People didn't really send text messages to each other as conversations. The only thing that existed before WeChat, which happened to also be owned by Tencent, is QQ Messenger, and that was like MSN Messenger. So imagine going from MSN directly to WeChat without text messages, without WhatsApp, without any mobile messaging.
Yeah.
And that's what happened. And I think I always go back to the kind of like convenience ROI. So how much effort do you put in order to get the reward of convenience? And imagine going from MSN Messenger direct to WeChat. Like, that's huge, right? Like, all of a sudden, you can talk to your friends on a mobile phone without having to use your computer, without having to log in. You can take videos, you can send them voice messages. That's another big thing, right? So voice messages never existed really in the West until WeChat started doing it. And then WhatsApp was like, all right, this is a great idea. Let's do voice messages. So going from QQ and going from desktop to having like WeChat, being able to connect to your friends by scanning their QR codes, being able to send messages on your mobile phone, be able to send voice recordings, being able to like post your moments as well on your mobile phone and see kind of what your friends are doing. These are very big steps.
And they happen so fast.
Yeah, it happened so fast,
which
exactly.
Which is really interesting because, I mean, we had all these changes that we thought were fast in the West. Like, we thought, oh my God, there's Facebook now, and there's this now, and there's that now.
Yeah.
But actually, it's not that fast because you've got time to adjust and to get used to it. And then you're like, oh, okay, this is what we talked about with Matthew Brennan last episode about having a certain tool to do a certain thing, whereas in China it's always been like a hybrid model. So you had this, but then it changed the next day and you got new functions that you could use and adapt to.
Exactly.
It was way faster and way easier than.
And we
than
didn't have like,
yeah.
do you remember MySpace?
Yes,
and
I
like
do, yeah.
Bebo.
Yeah.
And like there was a very, I say slow, it was very fast. It was like a slower evolution of social media platforms. You had like Bebo and you had MySpace, and like Friendster and stuff. And then you had like Facebook. In China, the evolution was much faster. I think you had like Renren or like Xiaonei, which was kind of like a clone of Facebook. But that kind of like came and went in like a year or two. And then it just went straight onto like a mobile social media platform like WeChat.
Yeah.
So you're 100% right. Everything just happens much faster in China. But I think also China kind of like learned from the West in the way that certain things doesn't work. So they just go straight to the next thing.
Yeah.
And they don't have to go through that process. But when you go through that process of evolution with technology or service design, the downside is that you get people attached to kind of legacy technology. So you can't get people away. It's difficult to get people away from like contactless cards or Apple Pay straight onto kind of like true mobile wallets.
Yeah.
Because again, like the ROI and convenience is not as high. But in China, they didn't exist. So like I said before, kind of like cash to true mobile payments was much easier. I think QR code format made a big difference to the success of WeChat with kind of like the offline to online enabling offline to online communication between consumers, between audiences to each other, as well as kind of consumers and retailers. And so while we're on the topic of WeChat, I think it's important to also talk about why we think WeChat as a platform has gotten so popular in China so quickly. Because it, like I said, like we just said, right, it wasn't the first social media platform, and it's not the only social media platform either in China. So why has WeChat gotten so popular? I think, kind of like in my mind, WeChat has always been about it's enabling like the networking culture in China, right? So it's enabling like the online version of the Guanxi culture.
Yeah.
And for any of our audience that don't know what Guanxi is, I want to do like a quick explanation. So in the West, you would have like a kind of like a web. It's more like a web of your contacts, your network. If you need something from someone, if you need like a favor, if you need a doctor or plumber, or even if you need someone to, I don't know, say you're setting up a business, you need an investor, you would go to your friend, and if they don't know anyone, they would introduce you to their friend. So you lose like the original point of contact, the original middleman that gave you the contact. So you're pushed onto someone else and then onto their web. In China, you never really lose that middle point. So Guanxi is like a network. It's kind of like more like a star topology where you kind of one of your friends would know a lot of people, but they would kind of enable you. They would introduce you, but at the same time, they would also facilitate any communications. So you're never losing like the original the original person that introduced you to that contact. So
it's always a very close relationship.
Yeah, it's kind of everything is very closed.
Trust.
Yeah, there's always a lot of trust, and it's always been a culture. China is a very collective culture, right? It's always about kind of like trust, about networks. I don't know if I'm going to go off tangent by talking about like why I think this is, but I think it's interesting.
About with China, yeah.
So the reason I think this has happened is because China as a country has been in pretty much civil war, like throughout the entirety of its like 3,000 to 5,000 year history, right? Like all the time. There was never kind of stability around the state. So family units had to be much closer together to, and that create networks, right? You have your friendship networks, you have your family networks. Like that was the only thing that was consistent in kind of like China throughout its civilization, because you had warlords, you had warring states, you had emperors. It was always constant kind of like turmoil, and it was very difficult for people. So China had this kind of created this almost culture.
Trust circle.
Yeah, like a trust circle that where you would have something that is consistent because you know your family. If for your next generation, your friends, daughters and sons, your families, your uncles and your aunts, your cousins, they would always have this circle of trust, right? Whether it was like ruled by like, I don't know, the Ming dynasty or the Tang dynasty, it doesn't matter who the emperor was, they always had this circle of trust. And I think that's why this has happened. And WeChat did a really smart thing by creating a social media network that was focused around this. So it was like an online reflection of the Guanxi culture. It's a completely closed social media platform as opposed to like Facebook and Twitter, which is kind of like open and broadcast. So sometimes you would see, I always use the example because it's a really good example. Sometimes you would see someone talking to themselves as if they were talking to themselves under comments of a certain post, one of your friends' posts. When they're not talking to themselves, is because you can't see the person they're talking to because you're not directly connected to them.
It's sometimes really confusing on WeChat.
Yeah, why are you talking to yourself? It's not like, there's no like first connection, second connection, third connection like you do get on LinkedIn or Facebook. It's just one connection. You're either connected or you're not. If you're connected, you can see everything. If you're not connected, you can't see anything.
Exactly. And then the only way to be connected is for someone to introduce you.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's always a middleman, and you know who's connected you with whom. I think that's a really important thing also to consider with consumerism, why it took off so much, because China is a sharing culture. And they share because they trust each other. So if I have a nice product, then like a nice lipstick or something, I'm definitely going to go to my friend and be like, oh, I've got this nice lipstick. Here you go. And then I'm going to share it on WeChat or whatever. And I think that's also why, because in the West, it's all about a bit more
Yeah.
individualized, and I might buy this product for myself because I like it, but I'm not necessarily going to share it immediately. Whereas in China, everything's shared, and that's why it's accelerated so quickly. And that's why platforms like Pinduoduo have taken off so much,
Yeah.
I think.
It's a very good point. I think this kind of like, because we talk about the difference between how brands should think of Chinese consumers and how they should think of Western consumers. So in the West, a lot of marketing has been about kind of like broadcasts. So you build your brand, you build loyalty around your brand. But in China, I think it's much more about how do you build kind of like almost how do you build word of mouth, right? Word of mouth marketing is important in the West as it is in China, but I think in China it trumps anything else because people buy based on recommendation. We talked about this before when we're having just conversations, how like in the West, people use reviews to almost kind of like give them confirmation of what they're buying.
Yeah.
But in China, people use reviews to inform them about what they're buying. I think it's a major difference. And it goes back to the difference between independence culture, which is very Western, and the kind of collective culture, which is very Chinese. So I think brands really need to think about that when they're looking at their China strategies. How do you create a strategy that focuses on informing your consumers rather than kind of like confirming the decision that they would make on their own.
Yeah.
So helping them to make decisions by creating kind of like conversations around your brand.
Authentic.
From authentic.
From friends.
And that's what influencer marketing is so big in China. And we talked about this with Lauren as well.
It was a really interesting episode.
Yeah. We talked earlier about kind of like, I guess social commerce. You mentioned earlier briefly about how people would share what they buy on social media almost immediately, and then when you see someone sharing that, it kind of like is more of a drive for someone to buy something than if they saw like an ad on CCTV, which is like the Chinese version of BBC, right? So I think it's probably a nice point right now to move on to social commerce, and kind of like why social commerce is so big in China and how it's driven actually by the consumers rather than driven by the platforms themselves.
Yeah. And how it's made consumerism in China actually elevate to a level that we don't really understand.
We don't understand here, yeah, exactly.
No, in the West, it's completely on a different
and
scale.
Again, just like the QR code format, it's like how many times have we seen Facebook and Instagram try social commerce? Like so many times. And it's never really been successful. It's always been kind of like, I'd like to say it's always been, social commerce in the West is like commerce that happens on social platforms rather than like true social commerce where you are buying things in a social way with your friends. And you mentioned Pinduoduo, which is a great example of actual social commerce, right? It's like basically group buying. We talked about this before with Lauren again.
Yeah.
It's basically group buying. You purchase something with your friends and then you can drive the price down and you can share, and they gamify a lot of these purchases as well. But what I'm actually more interested in is the evolution of e-commerce in China. So again, when I was in China, obviously we never had the internet. When I first came over here, we started getting like 28.8K, which is really, really slow. And then 56K and 128K. And then it happened very quickly. So we would start getting e-commerce channels like Amazon, like eBay, big e-commerce sites. And those were kind of like I like to call them the kind of like the totem example of online shopping. And they set the scene and they set the bar and gave everyone confidence that online shopping is okay. In China, that's obviously happened much, much later. So while we were having stuff like ASOS, so kind of like online shops and then brand.com websites like either adidas.com or whatever, China was still really didn't have an online shopping culture. Even back then, this was like, I don't know, maybe like 10 years ago. So we were buying a lot of stuff online already. I remember like play.com. I don't know if any of the audience remember play.com. It's now, do you remember play.com?
No.
Wow. So it's now like Rakuten, I think. You know Rakuten?
No.
So
I guess maybe we didn't have all these things in Germany. I don't
maybe.
know.
Oh yeah, of
We
course
had
you were in
Amazon
Germany.
and stuff.
But yeah, I remember these kind of like multi-product, multi-brand stores. That's for me, that was the next evolution. So from like big platforms like Amazon, like eBay, then to kind of like brand.com websites, to niche product websites. So Play.com focused on DVDs and music, and ASOS obviously focused on fashion. China didn't really have that. And that's actually where the Western e-commerce evolution stopped. And now we're still buying stuff off ASOS, still buying stuff off like Rakuten, still buying off this either brand.com sites or niche websites. Whereas in China, the pickup was much slower, right?
Yeah, but now you can buy things everywhere.
You can buy things everywhere.
On
You can,
every single
You can buy
platform.
things while you're like on WeChat, while you're just like live streaming, watching someone's live stream. And that's crazy. So in China, we had Tmall and Taobao, which came only less than 10 years ago, right? Less than 10 years ago.
Tmall and Taobao is what people compare to Amazon.
Yeah, so Tmall, maybe we should explain that quickly to the audience. So Taobao is like eBay, right? It's like C2C, and Tmall is like B2C, right? It's kind of like, mostly it's B2C. It's pretty much entirely B2C. It's kind of like almost like the mini shop version of Taobao, where things are a bit more official.
And you can open a shop and sell your products on there. Things
Exactly,
like that.
yeah. So that was kind of like, for me, kind of like e-commerce platforms for people to get online and kind of trust online shopping. But the major difference is that China never really had everything in between. So China didn't have brand.com websites. They had brand.com websites, but it was never really a big thing. People still only really purchase, like more than 80% of people purchase on these big platforms like JD, which is competitor to Tmall, very similar, again, B2C, Taobao, C2C. And then China evolved out of that not evolved out of that, but kind of like moved on to the next stage very quickly. And that's, for me, that's social commerce. So the first iteration we saw was WeChat, kind of like starting Weidian. And that was like a couple of years ago now, I think. Can't remember.
Not too long ago.
Not too long ago, very recently. And for me, that was a really great evolution of creating kind of like artisan shops that focused on very niche products, right? You would see stuff like people selling, this is like really, really crazy example, like I love food. So I was kind of, there's actually a lot of food on Weidian on like WeChat mini stores. And you get people like selling these like jars of like the crab roll and the tamale, so like the yellow bits in the crab that's like really nice and like really creamy, like you know what I'm talking about. So people will sell like really niche products like that, right? Like a lot of people wouldn't even heard of. That's very popular in China, or even very popular among a specific audience. And for me, that's what social can do, because WeChat has these kind of like niche networks and niche circles and groups that they can focus more on creating quality artisan products that are made for specific groups. And for me, that should be the next evolution in social media, social commerce and in e-commerce in general. It's kind of like, how do we take the best of social media and the best of e-commerce and combine it together, rather than just buying and selling shit on social media channels.
Yeah, definitely.
And then we have live streaming, which is absolutely awesome, because live streaming itself is not a new thing. Again, it's not a new thing. It's existed in the West for a long time. You have like Twitch, and before that you have Periscope. And again, like Lauren mentioned, kind of the history of live streaming in episode 1, and then something crazy happened. Not crazy, but something very different happened. So China has moved straight onto almost live shopping. So again, taking the best part of social media, the interactive element, the engagement element, and then taking the best part of e-commerce, where you can actually buy based on the interaction, based on the engagement that you have with these influencers. And I'm not sure if this will actually work in the West, because people, again, like we said earlier, right? People don't buy things based on information, they don't buy things based on recommendations as much as their own research. So recommendations is to confirm rather than to inform. Whereas in China, people have this innate, based on kind of the Guanxi culture, innate trust of people that they respect or they see as their peers. So people use influencers to inform rather than just to confirm.
Yeah.
And that's
also,
why.
like, I think you also need to bear in mind that if you introduce new features over here, they won't take off as quickly, because I probably wouldn't trust a live stream and then buy directly from this live stream. Even if my friend was like, oh, this is fine. I don't know. I think I'd want to wait and see what people think of it first, and like watch it a bit and then do my own research.
Is it less about trust and more about just habits? Like you just...
maybe. Or more about like preventing loss or something, if that makes sense. Like safeguarding yourself from making any mistakes. Whereas in China, it's like, oh yeah, my friend said it was good, so I'm just going to try it.
So again, that's kind of like that must be like ingrained in you. It's like you need to do your own research, right? You can't just buy something based on someone telling you that it's great. You're gonna go on and do some research, and you want to confirm yourself rather than kind of getting other people to confirm your purchase and decisions.
Exactly.
I think that's a big thing that people need to be aware of.
Yeah, but that's also why it's really, really important in China, because Xi Jinping is trying to drive China more into consumerism, as in the economy should be based a third on actual consumerism. So I think this is why it's really, really important, especially because there is such a big divide between the rich and the poor in China at the moment. China has more billionaires than the US at the moment, which is crazy.
That's crazy.
But it also has some of the poorest people in the world.
Yeah.
And I mean, you know that, or you see that when you go traveling.
Of course,
you see like really poor people in the countryside, and maybe they have mobile phones, but they don't have all the products and stuff that people have in the first and second tier cities.
They don't have the kind of on the ground accessibility, and we talked about accessibility before in the sense that the reason mobile internet is taking off is because China is just far too big to have like a landline infrastructure, right? We can't build like a landline everywhere in China.
Yeah. That's why they rely on mobile.
Mobile, exactly.
And if you want to drive consumerism, if you want to lift people out of poverty, and if you've only got mobile, then mobile shopping is the way forward, or mobile e-commerce. And that's
so people, actually, this is very important, Louise. Thanks for reminding me. And it's very important because a lot of brands, when they go into China, they focus on tier 1 and tier 2 cities.
Yeah.
Right? They're like, oh, like, how do we make us massive in Shanghai, in Beijing, in Guangzhou, in Xi'an? These are not the cities that are growing anymore. Like, these are the cities that are driving the growth now or in the future of China. When brands go into China,
struggling because they're just already overloaded.
Because they're starting to stagnate, right? They've kind of almost reached their peak of growth. When brands go into China, they need to think about tier 3, tier 4 cities and kind of rural areas of China. That's where the growth is, because that's, like you said earlier, people have mobile phones there. People know how to use e-commerce platforms. People know how to buy things online. Like, what was that thing you showed me earlier? That Alibaba has announced that they're going to start a incubation to create 1,000 farmer influencers. Yeah. What does a farmer influencer look like? I'm super interested.
Yeah, so it's really funny. I mean, this has been talked about in the last couple of years or so. You keep seeing articles pop up of, I don't know, a farmer sitting next to the fire with their mobile phones on a stand, like live streaming to people.
Just like talking about farming life.
Yeah, it's just a crazy thing you can't really imagine over here. I don't know if I've ever seen a live stream of a farmer in the UK milking
have you ever seen a farmer here?
You go, fresh milk. I don't know, but there's so much potential behind this. And
exactly.
If massive platforms like Taobao invest in these things, then there's so much potential.
Because Chinese companies understand Chinese consumers, they know where the growth is, right? Whereas Western companies are focusing on like tier 1, tier 2 cities. These guys are like, you know what, actually, the growth is in tier 3 and tier 4, and we're going to help to facilitate that. And we're going to make sure our products are there. We're going to make sure that we're using the right influencers to talk about our products and our services. Now that you've said it actually reminds me, like, I follow a lot of like food channels on YouTube, and there's getting more and more Chinese content on YouTube. And there's like...
Even though it's blocked
in China, which is weird. I think they must have like... This is a thing, right? People think in tier 4 cities or in rural parts of China, it's just all like peasants. It's not true. Like those guys are probably using VPNs to upload their videos onto YouTube.
Yeah, they probably know how
right?
to use their phone better than I do.
Exactly. Like
how to cut their own short videos and things like that.
yeah, they clearly because they're making videos, and I see these guys. These are like they're basically like farmers or kind of like very chefs from rural areas. They would like. It's a very simple video. You get like this guy like cooking in a garden on like literally like a brick built stove, like burning actual actual just wood that they found from the street, and then using this big wok, cooking like really rustic stuff. I'm so hungry right now. Like cooking really rustic stuff, and you're thinking like, it's just like the area just looks so like rural and so rustic. How could they have like a camera to film themselves and then post it on YouTube?
Yeah, when it's literally just the mobile phones.
Yeah, exactly. It's awesome. And
it's so important because I don't think China, by doing this, by investing in these things, they don't want to show China as being poor. They don't want to show rural areas. They want to show China as being innovative and inclusive and investing in all sectors of society.
Yeah, it's like diverse, right? It's not just about the big skyscrapers. Yeah. And it's something I've always been kind of my bugbear is that when people think of China now, they think of like skyscrapers, they think of Shanghai, they think of Beijing, but there's so much more about China. You've traveled around China, right? So much more about China, like the people, the culture, the food, and everything that kind of surrounds and makes a country like such an interesting place to be.
Yeah.
And I think that's the areas that brands need to kind of like, marketers especially, like marketing is downstream from culture. Like if you don't understand culture deep enough, beyond just kind of like the skyscrapers, beyond what you see in the press and the platforms like WeChat and Weibo, it's going to be difficult to really kind of resonate and relate to the people that you're talking to.
Yeah, because I do think it's a very close-knit culture as such, because the Chinese culture is very unique, but they all have very common values, even though it's such a massive country and every province is different. And every province has its own like specialities, and even like the different tiers of cities within a province are probably different. The consumers within the tiers are different because they have different things available to them. But I do think that the core values of Chinese culture and society are shared by the vast majority.
And a lot of it is around the kind of like the sharing culture and the Guanxi culture that we talked a lot about.
And even though in like tier 1 cities, they say it's all going towards individualization, finding yourself and like expressing yourself, it's still within a circle. So you'd still, I mean, what's the use in being super individual if you can't share it with your friends?
Exactly. It's almost like we talked before about this actually, how it's like a contradiction. It's like collective individualism almost. It's kind of like you want to be individual in a specific constraint.
Yeah,
I think that's kind of like a very good summary of the evolution that's happening in China with kind of like the younger generation, and I guess it's probably a good time to talk about the future of consumerism, right? So kind of like how
consumers, what's the future?
Consumers, what's the future? So what's the future of consumerism and how the new generation are different from the previous generation, and they have to be different because even like the China that I grew up in is very different to the China that, I don't know, someone who was born after the noughties grew up in. Yeah. Like we saw when I was growing up, like I remember this distinctively. I remember coming to this country, so I went into year 7 secondary school, and I was in geography, and I was taught that China was a third world country almost. It was kind of like very poor. It didn't have any technology innovations. It didn't have any like kind of like global world leading infrastructure. And it wasn't nice. Like you don't want to be like coming from a country that you want to be proud of your country, right? But these guys, like the people who were born after noughties, all they've seen is the China that's essentially dominating the world. You talked about earlier how China has more billionaires in the US, and also China has 8 of the world's top 10 decacorns, and these are like $100 billion+ startups. China is dominating the startup scene. Like DJI, most people don't even know DJI is a Chinese company. They manufacture 80% of the consumer drones in the world. Like the Chinese government invests in AI more than any other country in the world. And these guys have only seen that. They've only seen and learned in schools and seen in the news. They've seen Uber pulling out of China because it couldn't compete with a local Chinese company, Didi Kuaidi.
And all these new homegrown Chinese brands that are popping up. And
Yeah, exactly.
making them really proud of made in China.
And we talked about how, like, going from made in China, design in China, how made in China is like when I was young, I remember seeing like all these little shitty plastic toys with like made in China logo. Like, it was such a negative connotation, right? People was like, oh, it's made in China, it's rubbish.
Yeah.
And now it's slowly changing to people are proud of the word of made in China. Like all this, like I was saying about all these technology companies, these are all made in China. Like these are designed in China, made in China, built in China.
Fashion as well.
Fashion is made in China. Exactly.
We've been talking about Chinese streetwear and Chinese streetwear brands. I mean, lots of amazing stuff coming out of China at the moment, and with true unique Chinese style.
And we could have a few episodes on like kind of like Chinese streetwear and how like the difference between design in China and made in China and how Chinese fashion has evolved over the years. But I think specifically to kind of like Chinese consumers, the difference between if you're a brand and if you're looking to talk to like the previous generation, kind of like I guess people who are maybe in their middle age now, and then to kind of like the newer generation like Gen Z and millennials, is that I think brands really need to be careful not to be overly confident. Almost you need to be humble. Like these guys are very proud, right? They know their country is doing well. So if you come in and be like, you know, we are Google, we're the best in the world, people are just going to be like, well, are you? Because we already have Baidu, we already have kind of like social search, which is what WeChat is doing now. This is not really that great. It's kind of like, and I think
we have a better version.
We have a better version of this. Is that we've moved on from web search. We're now into social search. You know, like if you go in as like like a fashion brand and talk about your heritage, like, well, you know, heritage is great, but we probably prefer like modernity and contemporary and innovation,
sustainability, and things
exactly
like that,
sustainability. So I think people need to be careful not to underestimate domestic brands and what's available to modern Chinese consumers, especially the younger millennial and Gen Z audience, and what they might prefer domestic brand over a foreign brand. Like I remember before when I was growing up, certainly Chinese people used to be like, oh, if it's made in Italy, it must be amazing. If it's made in like
Germany,
made in Germany is great.
I remember my teacher. I lived with them for a few weeks, and all her pots and pans were from Germany, and they were all like, "Oh, Germany's so great."
Germany stuff is amazing, but like nowadays, you know, like the Gen Z and millennials, maybe they're not kind of like.
There's no USP for Western brands to be like, oh yeah, my USP is that I'm a foreign brand.
Yeah, exactly.
So
that's
Chinese
what,
consumers are going to want to buy me.
They're not so wowed by just your USP of being in like a made in Germany, made in UK brand
Now
anymore.
you've got to actually compete with the local brands.
You've got to compete with domestic brands.
You really need to pull out your finger.
Who know your audience better, obviously, because they're domestic and they're Chinese, who are probably innovating much faster than you because they don't have legacy products that they have to hold on to for their global audience.
Who understand the platforms.
Exactly. And it's super important. Who understand how Chinese people buy and what platforms they use. So, you know, what are you doing that's better than these domestic brands? I think that's kind of like a super important topic.
Definitely need to invest a lot in differentiating yourself and making yourself look really good on the Chinese market.
Yeah, why? It's not just because you're made in the UK. It's not just because you got long heritage, right? It's like it's almost like you need to actually do some marketing and go back to basics.
Yeah, Chinese consumers have become so mature.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, they understand what's going on. They're not just cash cows. They're not anymore. Yeah, because previously it was like, oh, there's a Western brand that's come in, and oh, let's buy. And the Western brands were thinking, oh, these Chinese consumers are like cash cows. They love our
That's true.
brands.
That is genuinely what used to happen.
Yeah,
I
but
remember
nowadays
that.
it's just changed. And the Chinese consumers are like, we are not cash cows. We know what you're trying to do. We know you're just trying to sell more.
Yeah, exactly.
So unless you give us a message that actually resonates,
I'm just going to keep buying domestic brands.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So I think that's a good place to wrap up. Thank you very much, Louisa.
Thank you for having me.
And see you on the next episode.
Goodbye.